Okay, go for it, Linda.
Good morning, everybody. This is Linda DiStefano. I'm actually a former president of Tri-Counties 2 times over the years and very involved in the association, plus a CAR director representing Tri-Counties since the year 2000, and very involved in the forms and risk management. And that's what this purchase contract's all about. So I did with the attorney, our attorney, John Giardinelli, attend 12 hours of classes, pretty intense classes. The paperwork was several inches thick and we went through every page and it talked all about the purchase contract in detail. And the best part of those classes was it was with Neil Kalin, who is the attorney for CAR, who is very involved in the changes for the purchase contract, but was in the room when all the discussions took place to change the contract. Now, it was supposed to be coming out in December of 2020, but because of the pandemic, it was delayed till December 2021. So now we have our new purchase contract. I'm also a working broker. I work for Century 21 Care in Diamond Bar as their manager and training director. So I had a lot of experience now with the new contract. I actually see it as it's coming across my desk, checking our transactions for the company. And I've noticed in the last few months that this contract is really terrific. I'm seeing way less errors, way less empty spaces in the contract. So Laura will, in chat today, put what is called by CAR the quick guide, and it's revised December 2021 RPA. Some things are old, some things are new, and everything is better just for you, is what their quick guide is talking about. And it's all the items as discussed and we'll discuss today, but it's condensed on one piece of paper. And we think that'll help you, give you an overview to the new purchase contract. If you're brand new, we would probably recommend you take the course that is on the website for Tri-Counties, the 8-hour, I think it's condensed down to 6 hours with John Giardinelli, the company attorney, and myself. That was recorded in the beginning of December. That's a detailed analysis of the purchase contract. Today, we're just going to talk about the major changes to the contract because we only have the 2 hours. So without further ado, I'm going to move on. I wanted to tell you just some overviews. What they've done in the new contract is they've taken the first 3 pages of the contract and they've moved all the terms and timelines to that area. And that's pretty much the details. Now, the information regarding the grid situation and the items in the grid are explained in the rest of the pages of the contract. It is now 16 pages long. There's been some changes that you won't be using certain forms any longer, like the RCSDs, which is its representative capacity forms, because there's areas in the end of the contract where you can fill out the information if it's an entity, like somebody's signing for someone else. Somebody's buying or selling in a trust, and that information. So they tried to eliminate some forms, although nearly 70 forms were changed in December and changed because of the new purchase contract. So let's take a look. Laura has the purchase contract up on the screen, the new one that was revised in 12/21, and we're going to begin. Obviously, date prepared is very important information, but this is an offer from, that's where you would obviously put your buyer's names and the property to be acquired. What you'll notice in this first section is the parcels number, the assessor parcel numbers area is bigger now because some properties have more than one assessor parcel number. So that gives you an area there where you could put additional APNs there. Agency didn't change much, just looking there. We did have a note from the attorneys about this area for the transaction coordinators. Know that it's not a requirement, and it states that there, that the buyer's agent's not legally required to give the seller a copy of their AD, and the selling agent is not legally obligated to give the buyer's agent the signed AD from the seller. So just for your files and to know, you're required to keep your agency disclosure in your file, but you don't necessarily have to pass it on to the other side. Although the agency disclosure must go with the contract signed by the buyer. So if you see that particular area has not changed, make sure you check the blocks, put all the license numbers in, the proper names of the companies and the agents. And we'll move on to section C, 2C. If you notice there, more than one brokerage has been added or for the seller or the buyer, and then also see additional broker acknowledgement. If that area is being checked, they want you to use the ABA form to add the additional broker. A lot of companies now are sharing listings or sharing buyers. So they've made an area there where you can notify everybody that there's an additional brokerage involved. The next section didn't change, potentially competing other buyers and sellers. That form is attached to the bundle of the RPA. That's the PRBS that I'm talking about in 2D. Now let's talk about the grid. Here's where most of the changes have taken place, new area. Like I say, I see contracts every day, and everyone seems to be cooperating and filling in the information as required on this grid. I'm not seeing a lot of issues. As we go through the grid, I will talk to you about things I have seen come up, and you might want to avoid those issues when you write the contract. So if you look 3, and if you go down the first column, A, B, C, you'll see D1, D2, E1. When you're referring back to the contract, perhaps in a counteroffer, you might want to just say area 3A, 2B, or 3D1, 2B. If you're going to, rather than to write out the initial deposit should be, you can refer back to the grid. The grid is a really great area here where you can place the information that you're gathering from the buyer regarding their offer. So paragraph 1 is to what area as part of the grid that something is in. If you look at the second section, paragraph number, when you look at the paragraph number, for example, we use the purchase price. You would put the purchase price the buyer wants to offer in the 1, 2, 3, 4th column. If you look at paragraph number 5, it'll explain about the purchase price of the contract in that area paragraph that follows the grid. So you'll see if I would go to paragraph 5, it would refer you back to paragraph 3A in your grid. So the purchase price obviously would be, and your terms and conditions and additional terms. If it's an all cash offer, remember that used to be a paragraph, all cash offer. Well, now it's check the block to indicate if your buyer's paying all cash. So if you go down to close of escrow, how many days after acceptance does the buyer want to close escrow, or there's a date there. You can put a particular date if the buyer would like to close on a particular date. 3C, if you look for in paragraph 32A, you'll see a whole explanation of expiration of the offer. Remember, this used to be above the buyer's signature in the old contract. So now it's right up front in the first page of the contract. And if you look over under terms and conditions, 3 calendar days after the buyer's signature, or when is the expected expiration of the offer. I get a lot of questions from agents. Can I make multiple offers? We checked with the attorneys at CAR, and what their response was, if a buyer is making multiple offers, you have to disclose that in writing in the contract. And of course, if a seller sees that a buyer is making multiple offers, they're really not going to pay much attention to their offer. So what the recommendation is to make the time of expiration of offer shorter, that the buyer wouldn't be obligated after a period of time. So I'll give you an example. On 3C, expiration of offer, if the buyer wants to make a multiple offer, in other words, likes 2 properties, You may want to give this particular seller on the first one 24 hours to answer. So you would put the date of tomorrow at 5:00 p.m. perhaps. And then the buyer's obligation for this offer would end at that time. It doesn't mean that the seller can't 2, 3, 5, 10 days later come back and say, hey, do you want to negotiate further on your offer? But it stops the obligation of the buyer in 24 hours. Then they can make the offer on the second property. So in essence, they have 2 offers out there, but actually the first one has already expired for the seller. So just to give you an idea that in dealing with multiple offers, a lot of buyers are wanting to do that now because it's so hard to get a property with lack of inventory. So let's go to initial deposit amount. This is obviously very similar to what you're used to. How much is the initial deposit that the buyer is going to make? Is it 1%, 2, 3%? And when are they going to do that is over under additional terms. Within 3 business days is what the default is. But if the buyer needs more time or wishes to put the money in sooner, you can check the block. Whenever you see a block in front of a line in the contract, that block must be checked if you add something to the line. And I will tell you, I've been working with the CAR attorneys to talk to the zip form people, because if it's a rule that when you put something on the line, the block gets checked, I don't understand why zip forms, when you add something to the line, doesn't automatically check the block. So we are working on that in the background and seeing if we could get that programmed so you won't forget to check the blocks, because I do see a lot of problems with that. Somebody will write something in, but don't check the block. Well, is that what you want or not? Do you want to go back to what's printed here? For example, the 3 days. Or maybe they need 5 days to put the money in after acceptance. So you would put 5 next to or in the 3rd column there regarding initial deposit amount. So, and Laura and I spoke earlier, if there's questions, because I'm going fast, I know I'm going fast because I have a lot of information to cover, but if you have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we will stop and answer your question for you. She'll be watching to see if any questions come up for us. So let's go to increased deposit. Here's where a change took place. The form on increased deposits before was the RID. It was a receipt for increased deposit. And if you see, it states here, money placed into escrow after the initial deposit is what we're talking about. And it's now use form DID at the time increased deposit is made. So that stands for delivery of increased deposit. Now, I will tell you, don't forget to get this form signed, especially if you're on the listing side. Make sure if a buyer is putting additional money after the initial deposit, make sure the seller makes sure the buyer is signing the DID. If not, it could possibly, if a dispute arises in the contract, the seller may only be able to go against the buyer for the initial deposit and not include the increased deposit, even if they can show proof of damages. So make sure that when there's an increased deposit being made, the DID, which is now the new form, gets signed. And you would put the amount of the increased deposit or percentage of the increased deposit, and on the last column, additional terms, when that deposit will be made. And like I say, if you're adding a date, check the block. Loan amount. This is now defaulting to a fixed rate, or you check initial adjustable rate not to exceed. I noticed in the old contract, this was a big pet peeve of mine. Everybody would leave this blank, not put terms. But well, you need to have terms in a contract. So now, please be careful, check with your lenders if you already have pre-qualified buyers, because the rates did jump, and you may have to adjust some of your pre-qualification letters, pre-approval letters to accommodate any new interest rate changes. So the loan amount, the first loan amount you would put there and dollar amount, and it will automatically put the percentage for you. It calculates it for you. You don't have to calculate that. And then fixed rate or initial rate not to exceed. This must be completed And then buyer to pay 0 points up to so many points of the loan amount. You get this information from your lender. Don't assume the buyer knows. Talk to the lender. Talk to the lender about that interest rate as well. Once again, they changed today drastically. And also, you want to make sure that the buyer, you can't just throw a rate in there. You have to make sure the buyer is willing to pay up to that rate. But you got to remember too that the seller's looking at this and comparing it to other offers, and to make them feel more comfortable to take their property off the market for your buyer, you want to have a pleasing rate that the seller would agree that, hey, it can possibly go there while we're in escrow. And we're starting to get into that marketplace now because the rates are fluctuating. So down the bottom, it's within 17 days after acceptance. So on the right-hand side, it's going to default to conventional, or if checked, FHA, VA. And if you're using FHA or VA, you have to also have this form, these forms attached to the purchase contract, which are the FVAC and the HID. The FVAC is stating that the house has to appraise for the amount that the buyer is willing to pay for the property. The HID is a reminder that get inspections from Housing and Urban Development. Or is the seller financing the property, or is there other source of financing? You would check that and add that information in that column. And I'm on the additional terms for loan amount. Now, what I want to point out to you is also, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, about appraisal. FHA and FVA buyers cannot waive appraisal because of these forms that must be with the file. And also it states right there that the FVAC, that the house has to appraise. So there's a little more involved when you're going terms, we call them FVA and VA, FHA and VA. All right, if you notice something I said, and I want to point out, 17 days after acceptance, it's no longer 21 days for the removal of contingency for the loan. Everything has reverted back to 17 days. It was 17 days in the past, and a lot of agents couldn't get an answer from the lender for about 21 days. So it seemed like every transaction there was a request for extension of time to get the loan firmly approved by the lender. So they were asking for 2, 3, 4 days extra. So the CAR attorneys took that into account and made that contingency 21 days. Well, we're back to 17 now, because loans are actually taking less time to complete. They're actually around 30 days to do a loan if everybody's following through like they should be throughout the transaction. So notice the 17-day is a big difference, not 21. And you can write in 21, but once again, the seller's going to be looking at this and comparing it to other offers. There's also additional financed amount. When we get into these higher interest rates, just over my history in real estate for 35 years, you start getting different types of financing involved. Sometimes a buyer can only qualify for a first and a second loan to purchase their home. And that's where the second would come in, additional financing amount. And the same information is needed from the lender to put in the contract on how much their second would be, how much the interest rate would be. This has to be completed on what points they're willing to pay. And it does revert to conventional type financing, or they may be asking the seller to finance. So the additional amount, and that would be checked in the final column there on the end, or other source of where they're going to get their additional financing. Here's an area where it changed a lot too. This used to be a whole paragraph. Now it is in the grid, and the paragraph 7A explains occupancy type. This now reverts to primary. It used to say Are they going to live in the property? Or if not, they're secondary or whatever. And they've added that it may be a secondary home or an investment. Before it was just primary or investment. Now they've added secondary as the occupancy type of the property. So it reverts to primary, so you don't have to check anything if they're buying the house to live in. But if it is a second home, you check that block, or if it's an investment home and you check that block. Balance of down payment, if you're working in zip form to complete this, it'll do the math for you once you enter your purchase price and the amount of the initial deposit and the amount of the down payment and such, and how much obviously that they're going to finance. The computer will do the work for you regarding the math. And then total purchase price. So the grid, in the grid 3A and the bottom of the page must match. So for instance, if it's $500,000, 500,000 should be 500,000 up the top and 500,000 in the bottom. And then make sure your buyer's initial, the bottom of the page. And Laura's going to move up to the second page for us. Seller credit. This is if the buyer needs assistance, perhaps with closing costs. That's the only way that the seller can give the buyer money is towards their closing cost. And the block would be checked and the amount or percentage would be added to that area. Seller credit to be applied to the closing cost or other. If it's cash transaction, perhaps it could be other. It's lenders who qualify that they will not allow the seller to give the buyer any monies in a transaction other than for closing cost. So that's why it says the other, even though lenders won't allow other things. It could be a cash transaction and there could be other involved there. So additional financing terms, if there are any. We used to write in that area, seller to credit buyer so much towards closing costs, but it is covered in the paragraph above. So additional financing terms, if that is maybe involving a cosigner or something like that, you would put that information in that area. How about verification of all cash? Remember, this used to be a paragraph all its own as well. Cash transactions are discussed in 5B paragraph in the contract, but you can write in here verification of all cash. It's either attached to the offer and you do nothing because it defaults to you sending it attached to the offer, or within 3 days or so many other days they may need to prove they have the cash to buy. Get down to 3H2, verification of down payment and closing cost. Once again, is it attached to the offer? Because that's what it's going to default to. So if you don't check anything in this area, the seller should be able to look at additional documents that you're placing with the offer and see that they can see your verification of all cash or verification of the down payment and closing cost with the offer. Verification of loan applications. Some changes have taken place here to make it easier for you. Attached to the offer and or within 3 days after acceptance, it'll be supplied, or so many days after acceptance, maybe less days, maybe more days. You have the opportunity to put that in the terms and conditions column. Go to additional terms, and here's where the difference is. Now you can indicate what is being attached. Is it a pre-qualification? Is it a pre-approval? Or is it a fully underwritten? Laura? She'll adjust. There we go. Is it fully underwritten pre-approval? You need to check which one that is attached to the offer, if any. The good thing is a lot of times they're saying that you have to do a DU. That's a desktop underwriting. I would think that's probably a fully underwritten pre-approval, perhaps at a minimum of pre-approval. Okay, so let's go on. Final verification of condition. This used to be a paragraph way like in page 8 of the old contract. It's right here in the grid on page 2. And within 5 days, or so many days prior to close of escrow, is that when you're going to do what they're talking about is your walkthrough. People have asked me over time, why 5 days? Why is it? Well, if you look at the life of a transaction and you realize it's a an approval, and then they draw loan docs near towards the end of the transaction. Usually loan docs should hit escrow around that 5-day mark. And usually buyers feel more comfortable signing loan docs after they've seen the property again. And that's the thought process around 5 days. 5 days also gives escrow and title and lending time to get the loan funded and recorded. And so 5 days is usually a good mark that the buyer should be able to go in, see the property, and make sure everything that the seller says they're going to do to the property, if anything, because it's an as-is contract. The buyer gets time to verify that those things have been done, and give seller a little time that if they didn't do what they were supposed to do. So assignment request, this is something that is now on a timeline, and it has to be done by day 17. And this is if you're adding anybody to the contract, taking people off the contract. It's mostly for assignment. Maybe a buyer is going to assign the contract to another person. That must be done in proper paperwork within 17 days or maybe less days. Let's go into the contingency area. Once again, I've already mentioned the loan contingency has now been reduced to 17 days. It was 21 in the former contract. It is now back to 17 that it was originally. And or so many days after acceptance, you can add different days in there. However, like I say, sellers matching offers up and seeing who's taking less time to do what. And if you look at the last column under contingency removed, no loan contingency. This is where I want to stop and talk a moment about there are guides, quick guides that CAR has prepared. One in particular that I know our agency uses, and John Giardinelli, our attorney, has recommended that think about doing this. We actually took the quick guide regarding release of any contingencies. And in the quick guide, CAR attorneys have written information for both buyers and seller sides of the transaction, what it means when you release contingencies, especially early. What detriments or, possibility it could get your offer accepted. A lot of times in this market, that's what you're seeing. Everybody's releasing all the contingencies. But what the fear is that a year from now, when people think, oh, I paid too much and I didn't really get to examine the property, and I'm finding all these things wrong, my agent didn't protect me. And we're afraid there's going to be a rash of lawsuits regarding this. So what we've done at our agency, and the attorneys highly recommend, is if there's going to be releases of contingency, we want our agents to address this at the listing appointment with sellers, give them the guide, have them sign they received it. Make sure they read it. It's just one page. It's great information for you. You can go to car.org, and when you log in, up in the corner, there's a search section, and just put quick guides, and you will see a list of the quick guides that CAR attorneys have written to assist you and protect you.
So Linda, we have a question.
Sure.
Al wants to know, if I choose 10 days after receipt of documents, is that okay?
Yes. And we're gonna talk about that, because sometimes you'll put in, there's a 12-day escrow because it's cash, and all these contingencies are left at 17 days. Well, that's kind of silly. How can you release contingencies in 17 days when you've already closed escrow? So yes, you can make the time for review of disclosures from seller to buyer a shorter amount of time. And it's highly recommended you adjust these times when you are doing a shorter escrow. So the answer would be yes.
Thank you.
Welcome. And I want to talk a moment more about the quick guide. What we did, and I don't think CAR, the attorney, we checked it with our attorney. We put the name and date down the bottom of the form. We actually adjusted it with our logo for our company on these guides. So we actually use two different type guides, and I'll talk about that now. We use the non-contingent guide in case anybody wants to release contingencies. And sometimes sellers are going back to buyers. Hey, I'll sell you the house if you release all your contingencies coming in. I'm selling it as is. You know, I don't care what it appraises for, you pay the difference. And buyers are willing to do that to get the property. But there's loopholes to that, and you want to point them out to the buyers and sellers. You don't want to just sit there, just, oh yay, my buyer's going to get the house if they do this. There's consequences perhaps, and they could come back on you not being a good agent and protecting them. So if they're reading this document and signing they've received it from you, that's going to be a heavy help for you if you would be called on this. The other one is escalation clauses. There's a guide for escalation clauses and how they work. And an escalation clause is that a buyer would put in their offer, maybe up above in additional terms. Hey, I'll pay $1,000 off over your last bona fide offer. That's an escalation clause, and it should be written properly, and the buyers and the sellers both should be protected properly. So the guide guides you in that area. So you might want to go to car.org and look up the guides that they're called quick guides. QUICK guide, and Laura has added the quick guide that CAR prepared for all these changes in the contract as well, an overview to help you. So let's go on to appraisal. I know a lot of you are having no appraisal contingency signed. Like I say, I would highly recommend that you at minimum give them the quick guide to read and sign and put in your file that you did discuss it with them. And if you notice, it says removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal contingency rights in the FVAC. And that's that form we talked about for FHA-VA. So the buyer would still have rights to cancel if they're going FHA-VA, even though they release the appraisal contingency up front. Appraisal contingency is still 17 days like it was before. And it says appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at a minimum of purchase price, and you can write in what the buyer is willing to pay up to perhaps for an appraisal that would not come in for what they offered on the property. Okay. Next is the investigation of the property. Once again, 17 days like it was before. Informational access to the property is also 17 days. They've broken that down now, and it says buyer's right to access the property for informational purposes only is not a contingency and does not create additional cancellation rights for the buyer. So during the process, the 17 days, the buyer needs to not only be physically checking the property, but maybe checking for permits and things like that. Review of seller's documents. Within 17 days, the buyer has to review them, sign them, and get them back to the seller's side. All right. And or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later. Usually the buyers take the full 17 days to get them back, but they need to be gotten back to the seller's side. I'm going to talk a lot when we get into the meat of the contract about notices to perform and following the contract, and that's very important. Preliminary title report is, once again, the buyer gets 17 days to review that. Now, remember, like I just answered the question, these times can be changed, especially for a shorter escrow, in that maybe if it's a 15-day escrow, maybe by day 8 or 10, all these items would need to get done. And you need to put these after the or on the line here in this section of time to remove contingency section. Common interest disclosures, and that's once again 17 days, and review of leased or liened items. And remember, there's a lot of places that have solar and a lot of hero and PACE loans on properties for maybe air conditioning and other items that they've added to the property. The buyer should have the right to examine the paperwork and see what they're taking over. And I'm going to stop right in front of sale buyer's property and go over to the removal or waiver of contingency. And it states any contingency in L1 through 7 may be removed or waived by checking the applicable box above or attaching a contingency removal form and checking the applicable box therein. Removal or waiver at the time of offer is against the advice of the agent and see paragraph 8H, where it explains all that. It tells them, hey, it's really not wise. You want to have contingency rights to examine the property. And if you are attaching that contingency removal with the offer against the advice of the agent, like it states, you must check the block to indicate that that form is attached to this offer. So let's go on to the sale of the buyer's property. The COP form has changed, and it's changed dramatically. It spells out more information to the seller about the buyer's contingency. A lot of times you think, oh, contingency, seller will never accept that. Well, if the seller hasn't found their replacement property, perhaps they would take the buyer's contingency. Then in other words, they have to sell something in order to buy, to give them more time. So the sale of the buyer's property is not a contingency unless it's checked here. So you would check the block, and the COP form, if you're using zip forms, would add to the transaction, and make sure you read that form, understand the form, and explain it to the buyer, and the buyer can make their decisions. There's a lot of decisions to be made by the buyer on that form. One thing it does say repeatedly in the form is that if the buyer's contingency is in escrow when they take the seller off the market, and that contingency falls out of escrow, it's usually instantly that the seller can cancel the buyer and or renegotiate with them. So there's a lot of information in the COP forms to make sure that if you have a buyer with a contingency, you read that form and or ask your broker specific questions how to complete it properly. So let's talk about time of possession. It defaults here in the grid to upon notice of recording, or 6 o'clock p.m. Now, I know a lot of people are checking this block and putting 5 o'clock in there. The reason why it was moved from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the past is because your title person may be at the recorder of deeds office at 5 as they're closing and getting that document recorded. The reason why they needed the additional hour is to get time to get back to their car and call the escrow, and the escrow has time to confirm with everybody that it indeed recorded. So if you don't have to, leave it at 6 p.m. It really gives ample time for those counties that have late recordings to be able to get the information out to everybody it indeed recorded. Just because it records doesn't mean the information is to everybody. And if there's a particular time and date of possession that may be later, you're going to see seller occupied or vacant property information down below this section. Now, also, the TOPA form is a new form, and it's tenant occupied form. Regardless of what kind of tenant, I don't care if the seller says, well, there's a tenant in there now, but they're moving out this weekend, so we don't need to use the TOPA form. Yes, you do. You have no idea what's been going on in this marketplace with tenants who find out a little bit of information and think they can stay, and they can stay free in properties, and that's not the case. So if you use the TOPA form, you're at a minimum protecting the buyer. And so if there's a tenant of any sort in the property, even if the tenant is being adopted by the buyer, they're buying as an investment and they're going to adopt the tenant, the TOPA form must be used. That is a new form as of December 2021. So seller occupied or vacant units, it's either going to default to close of escrow, or if checked, how many days after close up to 29, you can use the SIP form, and you can look over here on the additional terms, and it says seller in possession form must be used for any days up to 29. And after that, if it's 30 days or more, the RLAS must be used, and that's a residential lease after sale. And what you want to make sure of is when you're allowing the seller to stay for any amount of time over, customarily a week is the max that a lender usually, will allow free from the buyer. However, we're noticing, because of the situation with lack of inventory and such, lenders are getting a little more lenient. But if the buyer is getting a loan to buy the property, you want to make sure with the lender that the seller may stay in the property anytime after close. Always just check with them. What is your guidelines? Some used to be 30 days max. Now we're seeing 1 and 2 months. So once again, I think the market is dictating these changes, but where this stems from, the lender being involved, when a buyer goes in to get a loan, they're asked, are you buying to live in the property or are you buying it for an investment? And if you're buying it for living in it, then what are you doing renting it out? So if you're creating an RLAS, the lender is going to say, well, wait a minute, I'm giving you rates and down payment for a primary residence loan. So we may have to change those things, and buyers aren't going to want to do that. So they need to get the information right from the lender. Okay. Tenant occupied unit. If that's the case, check the block. If checked, see the tenant occupied property addendum attached. And once again, any type of tenant, even if they're moving out tomorrow, I still would do the tenant occupied document, TOPA. So let's get into documents, fees, and compliance. Seller's delivery of documents hasn't changed. 7 days. The seller has 7 days. And I would highly recommend, I see it with our files, I would highly recommend when you list the property, get those disclosures completed at the same time you're getting the contract signed, because houses are going into escrow immediately. And that 7 days goes quickly because it's days, it's not business days. The only thing that's business days in this contract is the earnest money deposit being placed into escrow. And the reason why that's business days is because escrow is not open on weekends and holidays. So sign and return escrow holder general provisions. This used to be buried in a paragraph somewhere. It's right out here now telling you within 5 days after you receive the supplemental information from escrow, it has to be completed and returned. The reason being, there are searches that need to be done. And sometimes in those searches from sellers and on sellers and buyers, information comes up that needs to be handled, and it's best to know it up front rather than to wait till you're trying to close an escrow and you're on a wild goose chase. Time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. 3 days. Seller has 3 days to actually get those paid. Rely on escrow to find out from the association how they need to be paid. Sometimes they'll only accept escrow's check. So the seller has to make arrangements to get that money to escrow so they can write their check. Sometimes they're directed to go online into a portal and make those recommendations and ordering. Then how about this one? This cropped up in the grid and I really like it. Actually, I think it should be shorter amount of time, but it's 7 days. Install the smoke alarm, the carbon monoxide detector, and the water heater bracing. And if you go to paragraph 10B1 in the contract, you're going to see that it explains that there are inspectors to go out to the property. They're looking for everything about the property, every minute detail about the property. That's their job. But they're also looking to make sure the smoke alarms are incorrectly, the carbon monoxide and the bracing of the water heater is completed. Why I said I think it should be a shorter amount of time is that a lot of times inspectors go out immediately, maybe 2-3 days after acceptance, the inspector's out there. And if these items are not done when the inspector goes out, somebody has to pay a re-inspect fee now. And that's now falling on the seller in this contract. So I would, at time of listing, tell these sellers to get their smoke detectors in, their carbon monoxide detectors in, and their water heater braced. I would recommend even before they put it on the market, then there's no fear they have a re-inspect fee to pay for the buyer's inspector. And once again, I'll point that out when we get to that paragraph in the contract. And then make sure your buyer initials that page, and we'll move on, Laura. Okay, here's an area, and remember, always put the address at the top of the page and the date. This is an area, if you look at paragraph 9, as it indicates in the grid, it's going to explain everything attached to the property. Yes, that verbiage is there. In fact, it's been, I call it put on steroids. It's all the details, and I'll point some things out when we get there. But what agents are failing to do is check these blocks of what the buyer wants the seller to leave in the property. They're assuming that paragraph will take care of it. Don't do that. Make sure you find out from the buyer exactly what do you want the seller to leave with the property, and mark the blocks accordingly. What I'm told from lenders is that the house has to be habitable, so it at a minimum has to have a stove. So if refrigerator, wine refrigerator, washers, dryers, microwaves, all of that is to stay, check the blocks on behalf of the buyer. Now, I noticed in one of our offers we had come in, it said that the security camera equipment and a security system and smart home control devices were checked. And I asked the agent, I said, does this particular unit have these things? And she said, well, no, they don't. And I said, well, you need to counter them out, because it looks as though the seller is going to be providing these items. So don't put things in that aren't there, expecting the seller to add these to the property. That's not why this area is used. It's just to give a heads up, because sometimes sellers will say, I'm leaving the washer, dryer, refrigerator, and the buyer doesn't want them. They already have their own, and they don't want to have to get rid of the sellers when they move in. So this is a good area where you can check what you want and maybe add some information, sellers to remove items that they're saying they will leave in the MLS. Remember, the MLS isn't party to this contract. So whatever the MLS says, that information has to be transposed into this contract so everybody understands it. And there's plenty of room to add additional items in this area too, but check the block if you're adding something to the line. If there are items that are excluded, you're aware of that and you see that in the MLS, check the blocks and add the items that are excluded, especially if the buyer doesn't want them. You want to confirm that the buyer is aware. And that may eliminate a counteroffer. Maybe you wrote a great offer, but you didn't put the excluded items to confirm, because the MLS isn't party here. You haven't put those items. The seller has to counter, oh, buyer's aware that the seller's taking this is attached to the property. Buyer was okay with that, but that takes time. It also gives time for another buyer to come in and possibly beat your offer. So when you write an offer, you want to write the best offer that you can, most thorough offer, without having to expect a counteroffer, which once again, they could lose the property waiting for. I did make a note in this area, and people have asked about that in-ground plants are already included in the contract. So they can't be digging up all their nice flowers and trees and plants and things. Oh, well, they were mine, I'm taking them with me. No, anything that's in the ground would definitely have to be reserved or excluded by the seller and agreed upon with the buyer. That would be part of the negotiations. So let's move over into allocation of cost. This area is going to talk about who's paying for what. Let's see, natural hazard disclosure. You checked, either the buyer's paying for it, seller's paying for it, or both. Everybody agreed. Customarily, the seller would pay. Also, on additional terms, is the environmental report going to be included? People say to me, well, what is included in the environmental report? And I explain it this way. For instance, what if you see a flat backyard and think, oh my goodness, these people wanted to have a pool. And geez, this is a great flat backyard. They can put a pool in and they can do whatever they want back here. And you're telling the buyer that, oh my goodness, this is a great backyard to put a pool in. And they buy the house and they look at the NHD and there's nothing in the NHD because they didn't get the environmental portion of the NHD. And so they buy the house, close escrow, go down to the city or the county, wherever they need to, that applies, and get a permit for the pool. And they're told at the county or the city, well, you can't put a pool in that backyard. That has gas transmission lines, can't dig in the backyard. Who are they going to come and see? They're going to come and see you, the agent who told them you could put a beautiful pool in the backyard. So the environmental report part of the NHD will explain to them about those items. So you should be reading these reports. So we always check the environmental to be included in the NHD report, and any other report that the buyer would want attached to it. You would check the block and add that to the line, but provided by. Customarily, we give the seller the choice of that report, or maybe the buyer has an NHD company they want it provided by. You would put that information on the line. Other reports, if you notice and you look down through the grid, termite's not mentioned anywhere. And so customarily, buyers do want to have clear termite. Termite's not law, so they have to request it. Maybe a recommendation would be they ask for a termite report, a completion of work, and a clearance. And who's that be to be provided by? Either the buyer, the seller, or both. Maybe they'll negotiate it to be both. Maybe the buyer is willing to pay half, but the problem is going in, the buyer doesn't know how much that could cost them. So customarily they say seller, and then it may get negotiated. And any other report. I've seen roof certifications and roof reports, type of things like that written into these areas. How about smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing? Once again, customarily it's seller, but the buyer may want to pay for items like this to get the seller to reduce the price for them so they can afford the payment. So it's all in what's going on with that particular buyer, but customarily seller is responsible to take care of these items. How about government required point of sale inspections and reports? If you're in the area of Los Angeles and it's the city of Los Angeles, you know they have the 9A report. Needs to be an inspection done, needs to have somebody pay for the 9A, customarily the seller. So you would make sure that you would address this area, and customarily it's seller, but maybe your buyer needs it to be something different or is willing to share. Government required point of sale, corrective and remedial actions. Who's to take those actions? Mark the block. Escrow fees. Who's paying the escrow fees? Is the buyer paying them all for both sides? Seller paying them all for both sides? Are both paying them? Customarily, it's each pay their own fees. And that's an option here as well. And then escrow holder. Customarily, we have the sellers do that, but maybe the buyer has a particular escrow that they want to use. You put that name there. Owner's title policy, same thing as escrow. Who's paying for it? You got to mark the block. And title company, if different from the escrow holder, name the title company. Buyer's lender title insurance policy, and it just states that unless otherwise agreed, buyer shall purchase any title insurance policy insuring the buyer's lender. County transfer fees. Every county has a transfer fee, and it's $1.10 per thousand. It's just who you're going to check is going to pay that fee. Is it the buyer, the seller, or are they going to split it? Mark the appropriate block for that particular buyer. City transfer fees. There are a list of city transfer fees, and you can get that from the title company. And there are several cities that do have transfer fees. Los Angeles, for one, is an additional $4.50 per thousand, plus the $1.10 per thousand for the county. So the transfer fees in Los Angeles are quite high. And other cities in the state that have agreed, they've taken it to the voters and the voters agreed. Pomona, which includes Phillips Ranch, has an additional $2.20 per thousand for the city transfer tax fees. Riverside is another $1.10. So there are areas in our immediate area that do charge additional city transfer fees, but the county does always charge, and that's $1.10 per thousand. But get your list from your title rep. HOA fee preparation, disclosures. That's customarily seller. Certification fee for the HOA is the buyer's fee. So that's just broken down. There's not options there. HOA transfer fees. Customarily, it's the seller, but maybe they've made a choice to share it or the buyer's willing to pay it. And it says, unless otherwise agreed, seller shall pay for a separate HOA move out fee, and the buyer shall pay for a separate move in fee. Applies if separately billed or itemized with the cost of transfer fee. Private transfer fees, there were some homes, some tracts, and especially in the Chino Hills areas that were charging private transfer fees for a number of years after 2000. And you can find those in the exceptions section of the preliminary title report. If there are private transfer fees, it should also be stated in the listing. There's an area where you can look in the MLS to see if there's private transfer fees. And then customarily, it's the seller that pays those, but if the check block is checked, either buyer or both, they can show those fees. Fees are all over, they're random. So you'd have to look that up and get that information. Other fees and costs, you have the option of putting what those would be and choosing who would pay them. Home warranty plan. I'm very happy when they made the changes because they had just put home warranty plan here and no area to write anything in. And in the 1, 2, 3, 4th column there, who's going to pay for the home warranty? The buyer, the seller, or both are going to split it, or the buyer is going to waive it all together. You have to answer these questions here in the contract. What's the cost not to exceed? Because if you're asking the seller from the buyer, if the buyer's asking the seller to pay for something, you need to put the amount that they're asking them to pay and get an agreement from the seller to pay that. And then issued by who? What company? I've seen a lot. We put in customarily the buyer. Oh, there's your doggy. We'll be back to the contract in a moment. Okay, there we go. And we're at 3Q18, the home warranty. And issued by, customarily, you can put seller's choice, buyer's choice, or a particular company name that the buyer would like to use. Home warranty plan, go back over to the 3rd column, home warranty plan. Please add there what the buyer wants the seller to cover. There's all kinds of coverages that come with home warranty plans. A lot of us, over 2 years, we've worked on this. I've been on a committee that was working on this contract for 2 years. And we kept saying, put down the options so they can check. Well, there's so many options with the home warranty plan, but customarily it's either the upgraded plan, air conditioning, pool, spa, roof, whatever the buyer would like to have in their home warranty plan, which will just determine what the cost should be, add that there, because a lot of times it's escrow officers or transaction coordinators who are ordering these policies. They're not in the negotiations with the buyers and sellers like the agents are, and nobody tells them information regarding what plan the buyer wants or the seller's willing to pay for. And if you go to section 10C, you will notice that now in the contract, and this is a big change, it does state if the home warranty plan that the buyer wants exceeds the cost of what they have cost not to exceed of, the buyer will pay the balance. So the buyer will be billed through escrow for any balance. So say they put $500 down and the plan cost $600 with the options that they choose. The $100 would be on the buyer's side when they close escrow. Other terms. This is where you would put any other terms. Maybe the buyer wants something fixed by the seller prior to close of escrow. Maybe somebody's related in the transaction. And look at the MLS. What if in the MLS it states that the seller is also the agent, or the agent's also the seller? That indicates somebody's licensed, and that would be one of the people in the transaction, and that has to be disclosed. What if the buyer's licensed? What if it's you? You need to state this in other terms. It has to be, for instance, if you're buying a property, buyer is the agent representing themselves in this transaction, licensed in the state of California. Or if you see that the seller's licensed but not representing themselves, you state that as the agent filling out the contract. Once again, to avoid a counteroffer, perhaps you're putting all the details in the offer, but all parties are aware the seller is licensed salesperson in the state of California or broker, whatever the case would be, not representing themselves in this transaction if they hired another agent to represent them. And so make sure all those disclosures are there. And once again, relation, maybe you're selling a property to a sibling, a brother or a sister. All parties are aware the buyer's agent is representing their relation in this transaction, or their brother in this transaction, whatever, however you have to disclose it, disclose what's going on in the transaction. And make sure the buyer initials the bottom of the page. Once again, add the address to the top of the page, property addenda and advisories. Now, if you notice, it's probate agreement, manufactured home. Well, they used to be purchase contracts all their own. Well, now a big change is if you are writing a probate, if you are working on a manufactured home, you're going to use this form. You're going to use the new RPA and check these blocks. And when you check the blocks, you're going to see that form for instance, for the probate, the form PA-PA will be added, and it stands for probate addendum agreement. That will be added to the transaction, and that has to be completed with appropriate information and sent with this offer. So bottom line is there is no new contract for probate or manufactured home. You will use this document. Then tenant occupied property addendum, the TOPA, and it says should be checked whether current tenants will remain or not. Check the block, and the TOPA form will be added to your zip forms, has to be completed properly and sent with the offer. Tenancy in common purchase agreement, stock cooperative purchase addendum, anything checked there, then the form will be loaded, and or other. And if there's something other that you're adding to the contract as an addenda, property type addenda, that will be needing to go with the contract to the listing side. Other addenda. This agreement is subject to the terms contained in the addenda below. If you're typing out an addendum, different information that the buyer wants the seller to know, it could be addendum number 1, 2, 3 attached here. Check the block, and it has to go with the offer. Backup offer. What if the listing side says, hey, we've already gotten an accepted offer, and we are going to accept backup offers. If this is being sent as a backup offer, check the block and fill out the BUO form and its information and forward that with the offer. If the property has a septic, a well, monument, propane addendum, that's the SWPI form. When you check that block, that form will load, and once again, fill it out. Short sales. If it's in a short sale, the SSA form must go with the contract. Court confirmation addendum, the CCA form. Buyer's intent to exchange. Seller's intent to exchange. That information may be in the listing for the seller, and you would check that block, and that form would go. If the buyer's in an exchange, once again, check the block, send that form. Buyer and seller's advisories. If you see there's items already checked, that's because they're already in the bundle. The buyer's inspection advisory is attached to this contract. The wired fraud advisory is in the bundle. So is fair housing, and so is the California Privacy Act. Let me go a little bit in detail about the fair housing. Please read this document. As of next year, fair housing will be part of your renewal information that you will be learning as a renewal to your license. So fair housing will be part of your renewal after the 1st of next year.
Hey, Linda, we have a question.
Sure.
So this is from Al. So
Okay.
on this form, all disclosures needed are listed here, question mark. And what about a listing form?
Okay. First, the listing form is an agreement between the seller and the listing brokerage. So that is not displayed to anyone else. That's a form between sellers and listing brokerage. All disclosures are not mentioned here. in this grid? No. Disclosures are discussed further on in the paragraphs in the contract, what is required. So hopefully that answers your question. Hopefully we get to those paragraphs and I can point out those areas. I see
And
that.
I have one more.
I see that.
What are private transfer fees exactly?
Okay, let me explain. Years ago, not to pick on any builder, so I'll say ex-builder in Chino Hills decided that any subsequent buyer after the first buyer would pay, and I'll use a round figure, it could be $10,000, it could be $500. I'll just say pay $1,000 upon transfer of the home for any subsequent buyer. So the thing would be any buyer that would buy the property after the person who bought it from the building. This fee would be charged, and it's in the exception area of the preliminary title report. You would find that there's private transfer fees on the property. The seller would be fully aware because they were the buyer who didn't have to pay the particular fee, but when they transfer the property to somebody else, and let's say that private transfer fee, I'll use an example, is for that builder's grandchild's college fund. Believe it or not, that was permitted. So every time the property transfers, $1,000 would go into that builder's grandson's college fund or whatever they designated that money to be. There were different things that private transfer fees were being placed on properties. It kind of has ended. It came out that they had to record them, and then when they started to have to record them, it was such foolishness that I think it finally stopped. But technically, there are homes that still have private transfer fees on them. So you can look it up, you can Google it, look it up, State of California private transfer fees, you'll get additional information, but that's a gist of what was going on. The only reason I know is because we lived through it. It's right in an area where we were selling and made aware that these private transfer fees did exist. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Linda.
Welcome. So I noticed in the buyers and sellers advisories, they have added the wildfire disaster advisory. Our company adds this to every transaction. I actually do the templates, and we check this block every time because wildfire disaster, you may be near an area where there's a wildfire disaster and a buyer would have liked you to give them a heads up. And, you know, any way you can avoid being sued for something in the future, you want to protect yourself. But we give this to all our transactions, the wildfire disaster advisory. It is strictly an advisory. Trust advisory. If the buyer's buying in trust, you would have the trust advisory. If it's an REO property that the buyer's buying, you give them the REO, which is real estate owned advisory. Our company, once again, also adds the SBSA, statewide buyer and seller advisory. That form's been revised and it has a table of contents, which is great, on page 2 to guide you through the different areas. But that form is so informative. It's everything about a real estate transaction, and maybe even private transfer fees are mentioned in there. I wouldn't be surprised. But the statewide buyer and seller advisory, we give those with every transaction to every buyer, just in case the seller doesn't give one as part of their package of disclosures that they send over to the buyer. Then there's a short sale information and advisory form. If the property is in a short sale situation, that would get checked and added to the bundle. And then the probate advisory, the PA. So they are basically the advisories that you can use with the transaction. There is the, and once again, more disclosures will be discussed in the body of the offer. That's why it's important not just to concentrate on pages 1 to 4 in this transaction, because all the meat of the matter and the information is in the paragraphs, and you need to cover those with the buyers. One of the things I like the best about the new contract, and it says it right on page 1 in paragraph 3, it says this form is 16 pages. The parties are advised to read all 16 pages. They're entering into a legal binding document. Well, guess what? It says the same thing above their signature. You need to be pointing that out to them. And as a risk management, I'm the chair of the Professional Standards Committee, and risk management, we would recommend that when you are sending something e-signed to a buyer or a seller, always send it email first. Keep this email in your file and state in the email, I'm sending you these documents prior to sending you these documents electronically so you can read them, ask me any questions, and then I will send them to you electronically to sign, and I will be on the phone with you while you electronically sign them. So then no one can go into a court or an arbitration in the future and say, the person just sent me everything to initial and sign. I didn't know what they were having me sign. And that would not look good on you if you have to end up in court like that.
So we have another question.
Sure.
What does the probate advisory disclose?
Okay. In a probate, sometimes the person has just passed and the executor gets the property. They haven't gone to court. They haven't figured out what to do, how to sell the property. There's all stages of probate. And the listing agent's responsibility would find out where it is in the probate process. You might not be able to close for 60 days, perhaps. Of course, people are working with attorneys, and attorneys will give them this information, but there's all stages of probate. So it will say, is this a court approved? Are all offers going to be gathered and one picked? What is the criteria of the probate? And it pretty much breaks it down in that document. And it should be in the listing, from the listing side, exactly what's going on, and assistance of how to fill out that form. I'm reading the question. So you're saying to send the PSA filled out completely? Which form? The PSA? Can you read that, Laura? Let me see.
It says, so you're saying to send the PSA filled out completely and let the buyer, the purchase agreement is what he means by PSA.
Oh.
And then let the buyer read it completely, then send it for signature?
Absolutely. 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 And let me explain why. I'm in the risk management committee for the state. It's a forum, actually, risk management forum for the state. And what we do there, we get attorneys coming in and speaking to us about risk management issues, how to properly do real estate. And they, unfortunately, get the duty of representing realtors in court. And there was a realtor that was taken to court by a buyer, and this attorney was with them. And the buyer accused the agent of just sending all the documents to them, and they electronically signed them, but got no explanation of what they were signing. And there was an issue in the transaction. So they sued their agent. And they said, you didn't guide us. You didn't tell us what I was signing. And the agent said, well, yes, I did. I explained everything to you. And the judge said, okay, explain it to me. And the judge waited about an hour and a half, 2 hours, the attorney said, and finally said, you lose. That person, and to be honest with you, I wouldn't want to have to explain everything to a judge, and I pretty much know the contract. So that agent was really in a bad situation, and they lost the in court, and it cost them a lot of money. So you need to be able to prove that first, you're the smart ones, you're in the class. But secondly, pass this information on to the buyers. Do you have to do it in the detail that I'm doing it? No, of course not. But give them an idea of what they're signing. Know the contract yourself. If you know nothing in this business, know the purchase contract, because everything you do stems from this agreement between the buyers and the sellers. So I see another question. What if the buyer looks at the document, and can you finish it for me? You're muted.
Okay, what if the buyer looks at the document, tells me I trust you, and refuses to read it all and willing to sign? How do I force him?
Okay, you don't force anybody to do anything. That's why you send that email and the documents attached out of zip forms. It's made very easily for you. Just like you click on everything to send e-sign, click on it first to email. Say, please look at the documents attached. Please review them. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will be sending them when you're ready. I will send them to you electronically sign. And the buyer's not going to be standing in court saying, I trusted them and that's not a problem. They're going to be upset over something, whatever. Just know that if that letter is in your file, that you made an attempt to have them read and understand what they were signing. It's going to go a long way for you as the agent. And like I say, you're in this class, so you're going to know how to explain this transaction and the documents to them. Hopefully that answers. Okay. So let's talk about additional terms affecting the purchase price, the deposit. And now it's going to go into your paragraphs. So every place in the paragraphs, every paragraph is going to refer you back to the grid. The one initial deposit, go back to the grid in 3D1. Do you see? And if you go to 3D1, it's going to reflect you back to 5A. That's the beauty of this transaction now and this contract. It's talking about increased deposit. It's talking about the retention of the deposit. 5A3, retention in paragraph 29, if initial by all parties, and that's liquidated damage clause. Okay, it specifies a remedy for the buyer's default. What I just want you to know is never tell a buyer, don't worry about it, he's going to give you the deposit back. Or don't say to a buyer, you're not going to lose your deposit. Don't say to a seller, well, if they cancel, then you can get their deposit. Always say there may be a claim. The seller may have a claim against your deposit. You're not promising anybody anything because you can't. The decisions won't be made by seller, buyer, or you. They'll be made by perhaps a court or an arbitrator or worked out in mediation. So know that don't tell somebody this is what's going to happen as a result of something you don't know. And it does mention non-refundable deposits. Those non-refundable deposit paragraphs and statements and sentences should be written by attorneys. Don't just write in there, X amount of dollars is to be sent to the seller of the buyer's deposit, and it's going to be non-refundable. That is not going to fly in a court of law. There has to be legal verbiage, so it should be written by an attorney. And those type of things are in this contract and states that.
So we have another question about
Sure.
clients reading and the contract.
Sure.
So we just advise the client to read and ask questions is sufficient?
Absolutely. That's all you can do. Absolutely. Just highly recommend they read it. You can actually give them the contract when you first start working with them to get them acclimated to the contract and start just telling them, read a page a day, just cover a page a day. That's what you should be doing till you get really sure of how to use this contract and utilize it and understand it. Just read a page a day. And you're going to get a wealth of information. Everything that could possibly be covered in a transaction is in these 16 pages, it seems to me, or an area where you can place information. Hopefully that helps. Once again, you're going down into the paragraphs in the contract, and it talks about, once again, the non-refundable clauses. Be very careful with those. This actually, the retention of deposit was actually in the liquidated damage section before in the old contract. All cash offers, once again, if you go to paragraph 3A, it states this was an all cash offer. Remember when we were in the grid, I said you could go to the paragraph and see all the details. First loans, once again, go back to paragraph 3E1. You can't get lost in this contract because you're referring back and forth if you need to go there. Let's see what else. If you look down in section 5C4, And it says that FHA, VA, if it's checked, the amendatory clause, the FBAC, shall be incorporated and signed by all parties. Buyer shall, within the time specified in 3E1, deliver to the seller a written notice on the RR form or the AEA form of any lender required buyer's request. And if you remember back, if you worked with the FHA and VA a lot, there used to be an FVA form that's no longer exist. It's now in this paragraph in the contract, and the request for repairs on FHA and VA RR form has that section in it. So the RR form, the request for repair form, has been expanded to cover those areas. And it says of any lender requirements, otherwise for the seller to correct, or that there are no lender requirements. They can check that as well. Notwithstanding the seller's agreement that the buyer may obtain FHA and VA financing, seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy any or all lender requirements unless agreed in writing. This paragraph used to be on page 1 of the purchase contract under financing. So now it's moved over to page 4 as an explanation of the area on the grid when you check that it's an FHA or VA loan. So know that lots of things have been changed around. I don't think much has been eliminated. A lot of things have been added. So if you look at balance of purchase price, down payment, including all cash funds to be deposited with the escrow holder, that's the same as it used to be. Limits on credits to the buyer. I want you to look at this one, section E here. Limits on credits to the buyer. A lot of times my agents will come to me and say, Linda, in lieu of repair, the seller wants to give the buyer $4,000. So there were a lot of things that the buyer wasn't aware that were wrong with the property when they bought it, and to stay in escrow, they need $4,000, and the seller won't have to fix anything. And I look at them and I say, I don't know. I don't know if the seller can give the buyer money towards closing costs, because I don't know if you've already made accommodations for them to have closing costs when you initially had the offer. Maybe it would, that $4,000 or $5,000 would exceed what the lender will allow. So the bottom line is here, there may be limits on credits to the buyer by the lender. Customarily with cash deals is not a situation, but it's a lender allowable credit that you have to find out from. Talk to your loan officer. Your loan officer, if they don't know, they can get the answer for you. So find out, especially if they've already negotiated closing costs for the buyer in the initial agreement. And now the seller wants to give the buyer more money towards repairs. There may be a limit, and the answer may be no. So additional financing terms, verification of the down payment and closing cost is in this section, and the explanation and the verification of loan application, and it's specified in paragraph 3E. You want to go up to closing and possession. Oh, let me touch on real quickly. Buyer stated financing, that section, where that came into play a few years ago, it was added to the transaction. What was happening was a lot of buyers were taking properties off market saying they were paying all cash. Seller would say, oh, cash, no appraisal, no issues. Yeah, we'll take the cash offer over the buyer that's paying with a loan. Then after they get an escrow, the buyer would go and get a loan. Well, wait a minute. The buyer who was getting a loan before was going to pay, willing to pay more money for the house, but because it was going to be quicker and less issues with appraisal, the seller accepted the cash offer and actually lost money. So they came up, CAR attorneys investigated it, and they came up with this situation that the buyers and the sellers should understand. If you offer me cash for my house and I take the house off the market for you, and even though I approve you getting a loan at no more cost to me and no time added, I'll let you do that. But if something happens with that loan, you have to go back to paying me cash. So that's what the buyer stated financing. In other words, they're referring to the buyer stated financing at the time the seller accepts their offer. That's the minimum they have to do. In other words, go back to cash purchase, not say, oh, I couldn't get that loan, so I want to cancel. They don't have cancellation rights for the loan. Hopefully that helps you. There is an area here for occupancy. So we're going under closing and possession occupancy, and it says that the buyer intends to occupy the property as indicated. Occupancy may impact availability of financing, and that's when we talked about if it goes over maybe 29, 39 days, maybe the lender won't allow the seller to stay in the property any longer than that. We're seeing all kinds of things cross our desks. Some sellers are asking they can stay in the property till summertime, till their kids are done school in their respective schools, and buyers are going in saying yes, but then the lender saying no. They're going to be staying months in the property. You bought the house as an owner-occupied property, which are different terms than what you are stating you're in now. So as you see, the condition of the property on closing is as is. It's the present condition of the property when the buyer bought the property. Now, there is a section here that's been added, and it's down 7B1 in the bottom of that paragraph. And it says, if items are not removed when possession is delivered to the buyer, all items shall be deemed abandoned. Buyer, after first delivering to the seller written notice to remove the items within 3 days, may pay to have such items removed or disposed of, and may bring legal action as per this agreement to receive reasonable cost from the seller. And I do have a note here that in CAR's legal law library they have in zip forms, there is a form you can use if this should happen to one of your buyers. They move in and there's a bunch of things left over from the seller. So that has been added to the contract. I think that's a really helpful thing for your buyers. And let's see, go down to seller remaining in possession after close. I've talked about this a lot. But just know the whole paragraph will help the buyer understand that yes, you want to help the seller out so they'll accept your offer, but there's limits to what the buyer can do. And it talks about that here. It may impact the seller's occupancy on the buyer's loan. It's exactly what we've been talking about. So let's go down to the contingency removal and contingencies and removal of contingencies. All right. Buyers should act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loan. And when things are bold in a contract, it means pay attention. It says if there's no appraisal contingency or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle the buyer to exercise cancellation rights pursuant to the loan contingency if the buyer is otherwise qualified for the specified loan and buyers able to satisfy the lender's non-appraisal conditions for closing the loan. So please pay attention if you are having the buyer or if the buyer chooses to release the contingency for appraisal. There's things that they have to understand that they may not have cancellation rights for any longer. Now, there was a lot of confusion, I know, with some of our agents included that said, oh, well, they waived the appraisal contingency. Why is the appraiser calling me to go into the property? They're not, when they waive the appraisal contingency, they're not waiving the appraisal. There has to be an appraisal on the property. They're only waiving the contingency of appraisal. In other words, if the house doesn't appraise, they can't say, well, the house didn't appraise, I want to cancel and get my money back within the 17 days. No, they can't do that. If they waive appraisal, that's not a reason for cancellation any longer, but the appraisal still has to be done for the advantage of the loan and for the buyer to get the money from the lender. So I hope we cleared up that issue for you. Okay, failure of the buyer, and I'm reading under 8A2. Failure of the buyer to obtain insurance may justify cancellation based on the investigation contingency, but not the loan contingency. So you have to watch the reasons why a buyer is canceling. Maybe there can't be insurance purchased in that area. If there is, it's an exorbitant price that the buyer can't afford. You have to make sure that the buyer does all their due diligence in investigating these items. You may even have the buyer call their insurance company when you find the property they want to make an offer on and get quotes for the insurance before they get into a contract and their money's stuck in escrow. And so, but this does give you some guidance here in these paragraphs. Okay. No loan contingency. Some buyers are going in with no loan contingency at all. So you can't even mention anything about the loan in order to cancel because it's not a contingency, so it doesn't exist. Then it goes into more information under the appraisal section. And if you look at I love it when in a paragraph they say, however, and usually means, ooh, something's going on here. The ability to cancel based on the measurements provided in an appraisal falls within the investigation of property contingency. It's directing you. If the buyer wants to cancel for reasons like this, it's directing you how to fill out that cancellation form to make it helpful to the sellers and buyers to understand. The appraisal contingency is solely limited to the value determined by the appraisal. For any cancellation based upon the appraisal contingency, buyer shall deliver a copy of the written appraisal to the seller upon the request by the seller. So, yeah, they may have to, they can't just say, well, the house didn't appraise, so I want to cancel. You have to, perhaps if the seller wants to see the appraisal, give them a copy. Whenever you're giving copies of things and this overall contract states, buyer, you can get any investigation you want. I'll open up the property to allow you to investigate the property in any way, but know that every investigation you do, you must give the seller a copy of that investigation at no cost to the seller. Also, investigation of property, that's still on this page. It's agreed, and this would be with paragraph 3L3 in the grid, contingent upon the buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property. So the buyer needs to be investigating everything about the property. I see a question came up. And it says, as an aside, as a licensed real estate broker, can you help me, Laura?
Purchasing for my own account and not representing the seller or anyone else, do I have to use the CAR purchase agreement / paperwork?
Absolutely. I would highly recommend it. Being a realtor and using these documents, you have added protection, legal protection for these documents. But say you give these documents for your cousin to use in a for sale by owner situation, your cousin's not covered, but you are legally covered by these documents if you use them. I would highly recommend using the CAR documentation. What I would do if it were me, I would call the hotline first and discuss it with them. But I think the answer you're going to get is these are probably going to protect you the best. That would be my recommendation. I did make a note here when I was in the class with the attorney, and it does say if the buyer removes appraisal contingency and the loan cannot close, this is the buyer's issue. So, you know, and when you say something's the buyer's issue, that usually means money. So that usually means they could possibly have the seller go against them for their deposit if they were damaged and could prove those damages. From Sharon, did you see that question?
So there's a couple of questions about what you just said.
Sure.
What about using an agreement drawn up by my attorney? And then Sharon says, so it's recommended, not have to, right?
It is recommended, not have to. However, before I would do anything like that, to, in other words, to make a purchase without using CAR forms, and I'm a broker myself, I would call the hotline and get directions direct from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go on to the next page, title. Why am I missing it? There it is, got it. Okay, make sure that you read your title policies. And if you don't know how to read a preliminary title report, please get somebody in from a title company to assist you and review them with your agents. Because just because you don't know how to read one doesn't mean you're not going to be responsible to be telling buyers and sellers about items in these reports. So really, I'm going to get on a soapbox here in a few minutes, because if we're going to go down to an area, of course, if it's condominium, you have to disclose to the buyer that they're buying in a condominium. Buyer to review leased or liened items. We've already discussed that, and this is detail about those items. Do you want to move it up a little bit? Removal or waiver of contingencies with the offer, and it does in bold again. When they put something in bold, they really want you to read it, really want you to understand it. Removal or waiver of contingencies, they keep repeating that throughout the transaction. It's not wise. You know, when they redid this contract, they brought it into today's market, which is what I liked about it. And I didn't mind the delay so much, because the last year, the business kind of went wonky, and they've added the wonky part into the contract now. So we're really happy about that. What if the buyer says, I don't understand the preliminary, and you read it and tell me what it is? Okay. I still would tell them, do your best to read it. And if you have questions, I will call my title officer. You have title reps, you have a TO, you have a title officer that you can ask questions of. Tell them, even if you don't understand it, read through it. And if there's something that crops up that seems suspicious to you or something, question us on it. But you also need to know how to read the preliminary title report. And they're pretty simple. I mean, it's just, you know, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And then there's normal stuff that's going to be, you know, if there's loans on the property, or, you know, get some instruction from your title company. I highly recommend that. We've done that. We've had title reps come in, and it really helps our agents to say, oh, okay, I wouldn't even have known to look there, for example. I agree with you. I don't want them to depend on what I say. They may be sued. No, tell them that you have a title rep that you can consult with, and the title officer. Title officer's name and number is right on the front of your preliminary title report. And they're a great source of information, but I usually call my title rep first. They talk to the TO, but I have called and asked questions of transaction or title reps myself. When there's something that crops up in a prelim that I don't understand myself. And I've seen a lot of stuff over the years, but there's sometimes things crop up and you're like, whoa, what's that supposed to mean? So let me state that you want to make sure that when buyers are releasing contingencies, they've done all their proper investigations. So just make sure by day 17 that you've encouraged them. There is a form to use to give them an idea of all the inspections and investigations they can do. You don't want to come back and say, well, my agent didn't tell me and there was something wrong with this. So start using your CAR forms to the best of your ability, that there is a form, buyer's investigation rights form. Use the form and give it to them and tell them, fill out whatever you want to.
Happy cry or sad cry.
Okay, so we're going to move down into included and excluded items. And I'm sorry I have to go fast, but we're running out of time. Like I said, this is an 8-hour course that I'm cramming into 2 hours. So note to the buyer and seller. Items listed as included or excluded in the MLS, and I've already mentioned this, and marketing materials are not included in the purchase price unless they're included in this contract. And what you want to make sure of is asking the buyer, do you want these items? Do you want them removed? Don't wait till the end of a transaction. Now the buyer walks in at the close of escrow to do their final investigation. Oh, this washer and dryer is going to be here. I didn't want that. Now you've got an upset client at the end of the transaction. Deal with all of this going in. Read the MLS. See what the listing agent's telling you. Items included in the sale, once again, it could be washers, dryers, refrigerators, freezers, and also everything listed. And one of the best parts of this, I think, because I had an issue with it with one of our transactions, an agent last year, it happened to be the agent buying the property. Long story short, she went into the walkthrough and the curtains were all removed. And she stated to the agent said, oh no, they're personal property. The seller gets those. And the agent knew, she had been in my class, and said, no, anything in a window treatment, anything that was on the window needs to stay. And the agent vehemently disagreed. And in fact, the broker got involved, the other broker, and said, why don't you give the seller a gift card and maybe they'll leave some of those curtains for you. And it got absurd. Anyway, I look at the new contract and here it is. And if you look at 9B2, it says regarding the windows. So whether you knew or not, it says window and door screens, awnings, shutters, window coverings. And in parentheses, and it says includes the blinds, the curtains, the drapery, the shutters, and any other materials that cover any portion of the window. I'm so grateful for these attorneys. And now there's nothing to argue over. It's in the contract. Now, if you want to reserve it, you exclude those items. Okay. And it says attached floor coverings, television antennas, satellite dishes, air coolers. I mean, it goes into details of what's to remain in the property. If you don't know, read the contract. It tells you right here. They've added a lot of different things to this area. And look at the bottom of that paragraph. Even the light bulbs, and recently we had a situation where the seller had all these expensive light bulbs throughout the house. The buyer moves in and all the light bulbs had been removed and replaced with just cheap light bulbs. That was an issue. And it says all the items specified as included if currently existing at the time of acceptance. So know that anything attached to the property unless excluded should remain, and that should help your buyer. In paragraph 9B4, they've added the smart devices and any smart home devices and features that are physically affixed to the real property. Also, existing light bulbs, it's talked about again, because light bulbs are getting quite expensive and people are spending a lot of money on them. And when a buyer sees the property, they want it to look the way it did when they bought it. And buyers advised to use paragraph 3P1 or an addendum to address more directly specific items to be included. Sellers advised to use a counteroffer to address more directly any item to be excluded. So once again, read your MLS, and if it's in the MLS, it's excluded, put it in the contract that all parties are aware, and that should help your buyers as well to understand they're not getting particular items, or if they want them, put that all parties are aware buyer would like the seller to include these items. There is an area where it says non-dedicated devices. All smart home and security system controlled devices are included in the sale, except for any non-dedicated personal computer, tablet, in other words, the things that do belong to the seller. Leased or liened items and systems. Once again, it's talking about items that to disclose to the buyer if any item or system specified in those 3P and 9B areas or otherwise included in the sale or leased or not owned by the seller. You have to get specific. And once again, items were checked, weren't in the unit that the buyers that we were the sellers that we were representing. The buyer's offer came in adding all these things and they didn't exist. Well, the seller didn't want to be responsible for buying those things and putting them in the unit. So be very careful about specific details of the contract. So let's move on to items excluded from sale area. We're in the included area, Laura. Let's get down to excluded. There you go. Items excluded. Brackets go with the TV now. In the old contract, and this is a big change, in the old contract, you'd have a buyer and say, oh, you said anything attached to the property remains with the property. What about that TV that's on the wall in the family room? Is that mine if I buy this house? And we would have to tell them no, because the TV is actually attached to a bracket. The bracket is to remain, but the TV goes. Well, guess what? Now the bracket goes. So, and it states, unless otherwise specified in paragraph 3P1, referring you back to the grid, brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture, or item will be removed, and the holes or the other damage shall be repaired but not painted. So these are items you have to point out to the buyer and the seller, because the seller is going to be responsible to fix the holes after they take the bracket off the wall. They can't leave a big chunk of open wall for the buyer. So just be familiar and let the sellers and the buyers in your transactions know it's what is expected. We talked about the reinspection fees, and there they are in 10B3. Remember, tell your sellers, when you take the listing, tell them, get your smoke detectors, your water heater braced, and your carbon monoxide detectors in the property attached and where they need to be. Otherwise, if the inspector comes out, those items are not there, there will be a reinspection fee because they have to be there, and that will be to the seller's cost. And it says that there, seller shall be responsible for those costs. This is something new in the transaction you're not used to from before. These are things you have to introduce to the seller. So you can give them the option, hey, you can pay me now or pay me later. You can put them in now, or you not only have to put them in, you're going to have to pay a reinspect fee. And we don't know what that is. All right. Home warranty. We talked about that area, and make sure you put the optional coverages, write them in the section in the grid, which is 3Q18. Make sure those items are written in, because it's not you that's usually ordering that home protection policy. It's your TC or the escrow, and they need that information. So we're going to get down into statutory and other disclosures. One of the and we had this question earlier, are all these disclosures the ones listed? A lot of the disclosures that are going to be required by law are mentioned in this area, which is the TDS, and the attorneys are highly recommended the sellers use the SPQ. If not, at a minimum, they must use the ESD. The questions on the ESD are law to be answered from the seller to the buyer. The SPQ form is not law. However, on page 1 of the SPQ form is the ESD questions. We would recommend you not use an SPQ and an ESD in the same transaction, because this just happened recently, and another one of my transactions here at our office, for one of our buyers got an SPQ in from the seller and an ESD, and the sellers answered the questions on the ESD and the SPQ, the same question differently. So which one stands? So the SPQ is not law. Our broker requires an SPQ in every file, and that's the seller's property questionnaire. It gives detail that the seller can give to the buyer about the history of the property. And the ESD questions are not, the form isn't law, the questions are law, and they can be answered on the page 1 of the SPQ if your seller's using that as a disclosure. And
I had a question, Linda.
Sure.
In listing a probate seller that has never lived there, no TDS, correct?
That is usually correct. Yes, if they've never lived there, yes. But the agent is never excused from doing their diligent visual inspection. They can do that if their broker allows, fill out the form on page 3 of the TDS. They can fill out that section of the TDS, or preferably the AVID. But the agents never excuse, regardless of what type of transaction, to do their diligent visual inspection. And now by law, they have to use the FHDS form if the property is in a high fire severity area. And we have been using that form, we meaning the people at CAR are recommending using the form because it's not only the fire hazard form, it is also an advisory. So your property that you're selling may be sitting next to a high fire hazard area and so close that they really need the info. So not to worry, I would put the FHDS form in every transaction. Now, if it's not in a high fire hazard area, the seller checks that it's not in a high fire hazard area. If it is, they don't check that block. They go further on the form and answer the questions regarding fire hazards. The TDS is law, except in probate situations, you are correct. And also, let's see what else they address here. They're going to address the lead-based paint disclosure. That used to be the FLD form. Well, now it's the LPD form, which is properly, that's probably the proper name for that form. And it's lead paint disclosure. So if the house is older than 1978, that form must be in your file. And it states that right there under lead disclosures, B1, and it's prior to 78. If the house was built in 78, you do not use the form. You don't want extra liability in your files. Okay. One more thing about TDS. On section 1 of the TDS, it asks if there's any substitute disclosures. It's not likely that there are, but to complete a TDS, the seller obviously has to answer all the questions and complete all the areas that they have to complete. The date has to be there when they're filling it out. But something has to be checked in section 1. If section 1, something isn't checked, either there are supplemental disclosures or there are not, and customarily there are not. So if that third block is not checked and the agents each did not do their diligent visual inspection, regardless, depending on how their broker requires it at a minimum, either fill out page 3 of the TDS as the agent and mark what you saw during your diligent visual, or preferably do an AVID. The TDS is not complete, and the TDS must be complete and to the buyer by day 7 after acceptance. And we really, really want to make sure you understand to use your notices to perform. If you don't use your notices to perform throughout your transaction, and all of a sudden the seller needs to close escrow and wants to put a demand on the buyer, this is how it's been explained by the attorneys in our risk management, the judges or the arbitrator is going to look at the entire situation. Well, you didn't do anything when they put the deposit in late. You didn't do anything when they didn't release contingencies on time. You didn't do anything when this happened. You didn't do anything. You just let everything go. You didn't put anybody's notice on to perform, because those notices to perform don't say you're going to cancel. It says they may have the right to. And the notices to perform cannot be any shorter than 2 days. You can't make it less time, can only make it more time or stay with the 2 days. It's a 2-day notice. Demand to close escrow is a 3-day. But a judge or an arbitrator, as it's explained to us, is that they could say, well, wait a minute, you didn't do anything on time. Now you want me to honor the close of escrow date? Well, it's not going to happen. So know the contract, live by the contract, follow it. If on day 1, you're a smart listing agent, I would put a notice to perform on the buyer for their earnest money. And then that way, if the money's not in by day 3, because day 1 and 2 equals 3, and the money has to be in escrow within 3 business days, then the seller, maybe they want to accept a different offer, could possibly have the right to cancel on day 4. If you wait the 3 days and the money, 3 business days, and the money doesn't go in escrow, then the seller has to give a 2-day notice. You may lose that other buyer that was willing to pay maybe more than the other buyer was that you're already in escrow with and who's not cooperating. So then you've also set a precedent. We're all going to follow this contract. If something's coming up on a timeline, for instance, 17 days to release contingencies, use the notice to perform on day 15. Give them the heads up. Hey, by day 17, remember, you got to release contingencies in writing. And if they can't, they can then do an extension of time request, an extension of time addendum, and request some more time. But at least you're all communicating. You're not just letting things fall by the wayside, not following the contract. And the contract specifically says all those things I just talked to you about. So another area you want to get into real quickly here is another page, Laura, please. Okay, right there. Withholding taxes. We get a lot of issues with this because the contract clearly states the seller either has to give a completed, answer every question, give the social security number, everything. And the area I'm talking about is H here, withholding taxes, a QS or an AS at minimum to the buyer. And this is FIRPTA, this is foreign investor. Because listen, if your foreign investor closes escrow and doesn't pay taxes, your buyer's going to. Somebody's going to pay the taxes. So you have to find out up front within the first 7 days of acceptance, is this a foreign investor I'm dealing with? The buyer has to know this. They have to know this by receiving from the seller's side a completed AS, or at a minimum, a qualified substitute signed by escrow. In other words, escrow gathered the info and they're making the statement whether this is a foreign investor or not. If one of the two of these items don't pan out, in other words, you don't get a completed AS and there's no QS from escrow, it is recommended here, and it tells the buyer, you better contact escrow and have funds withheld for the seller's taxes. And it's funny how fast you're going to get a completed AS or QS. So that's something you want to pay special attention to. All righty, and what they tell us, the taxes could be 15% of the purchase price. All right, and that's federal law, by the way. AS is federal law. Let's look real quick if there's any major changes. In section 12, the buyer's investigation of property matters affecting the property. Yeah. All right. Under 12A2, all other buyer's investigations such as insurance, not specified above, see buyer's inspection advisory for more. So there's more ways you can talk to the buyer about what they need to be checking regarding purchasing a property. And it says they need to review all the review of the reports, disclosures, or information prepared by or for the seller and delivered to the buyer pursuant to paragraphs 3, 10, 11, and 14A. These are the things that buyer's investigations of the properties and the matters affecting the property is very important. Look at D. Seller shall make the property available for investigations. And also, they need to leave all utilities on. And that's through possession of the buyer. And that's where it states it right there in section D. So tell your sellers when you take your listings, you need to leave all utilities on through possession. Well, what's possession of the buyer? What if the buyer is buying the property and they're going to fix it up and take a few months to do that? Does the seller have to leave the utilities on for the buyer? No, absolutely not. It's what is possession stated in the contract. If it's close of escrow +3 that the seller has, then the seller needs to leave the utilities on through that 3rd day. And then they don't have to do that any longer. It's the buyer's responsibility to have the utilities transferred into their name. Okay, let's see. There's a section under title and vesting, section 13E, and they said this is to avoid money laundering. There's been information added per the title company about geo-targeting and such. So read that section. That's really interesting. And you all know that the matter of taking title has significant legal and tax consequences. And you should not be telling people how to take title. Have them check with the people that can tell them, maybe their tax person or attorney. And I do see there's a question.
Yes, the question is, termite inspection is hardly mentioned on this new RPA. How should we handle the termite inspection in section 1 and section 2 work?
Yes, good question. Well, remember when we go back to the beginning on the grid, and I'll tell you where we put it on our agency, and it would be under, let me bear with me a moment. I've shuffled everything. Yes, in section 3Q2. That's an area where you could request that the seller do whatever you want with the termite report. Termite report, we put termite report, completion of work, and clearance. Sorry about that. And that's to be paid for customarily by the seller. The reason why termite's not mentioned, this was a big deal years ago. We had, it used to be a paragraph all its own, and you would specify who's to do what. Well, termite isn't law. There's no law regarding termite. So they took it out because a lot of times, and it seemed like the North and the South were fighting one another with this. The North could care less about termite, and the South's got this termite issue that they worry about all the time, and maybe deservedly so, but it isn't in the contract. If it's not discussed and agreed upon in the contract, the buyer has the right to get a termite inspection. And if they want the seller to pay for anything regarding this, they can in the request for repair. There's actually a termite section in the request for repair. I wouldn't bank on them doing it, only because they're selling the property as is and it wasn't negotiated up front. So I would probably put it in the section that it's to be supplied by the seller and negotiated up front. Bill does not alleviate the fact that the buyer has the right to do a termite inspection and ask the seller to do the repairs. But once again, the seller has responses, and it's in writing in the contract. The seller can respond no. Their response could be no. It could be yes, I'll do it. I like you, buyer. I want to keep you in escrow. I'll pay that $1,000, take care of the termite. I'll split it with you. I'll, split the cost with you, or I'll do some things and not the others that you're asking me to do. Or it literally says, because the property sold as is, the contract literally says, I don't even have to respond to a request for repair. So the fact that we get a lot of buyers that say, well, I don't want to release contingency yet because they didn't respond to my request for repair. There's nowhere in the contract it says the seller has to respond. So by them not responding, the answer is no. So hopefully that helps you.
There's a follow-up. Where do you address this again on the contract?
Sure, it is in the grid. And it would be Q, we put it in 3Q2.
What page is that?
3.
3, okay. I'll go up to it so they can see it.
Sure. Yeah, we write it right in there, 3Q3, right up the top.
Right here.
There's a blank, we type it in, right in front of report. And then state who's going to pay for it. Maybe the buyer's going to pay for it. Maybe it's both. Maybe they're asking to split it with me, and you would click both. But what we put in there is termite report and clearance. You can put, because there's not a lot of area there, you could always use additional terms to specify what the buyer would like the seller to do. And if it's about a termite issue, use the additional terms. And Laura, that would be at the bottom of that page.
Right here.
Other terms, yes. Yeah, and you can put, see other terms, seller to provide termite report, completion of work, and termite clearance. And then up in the above section, and put that the sellers to pay for it, if that's what the buyer wants you to do.
Okay.
a good question regarding the lender. How I understand it is the lender's asking for termite reports because you're putting them in the contract. Anything in the contract, the lender has to see. So if you're typing in termite report to be paid for by the seller, you better tell who needs to do the work. So completion of work maybe, or clearance at minimum. The reason why the lender is asking for the report is because you wrote it in the contract. If it's not there, they're not going to ask. I do know that even if they have the let me back up. I do know even if you're requesting all of that and they don't have the report, the buyer to maybe close escrow quicker and make other arrangements can waive the termite. It's happened in several of our transactions. The buyer has to wait because there's not time to tent or whatever, and they trust the seller will pay to have it done, leave the money in escrow for the tenting to be done, whatever the case may be. But if the lender has the termite report, I understand the termite must be completed. So be careful passing those reports on to your lenders.
What page were we on?
We were on seller's right to cancel, so page 10.
Okay.
Okay, so this most of these items and the rest of these pages I've already touched on, and it's going to refer you back to the grid, but the rights to cancel are in this section. Seller's right to cancel, buyer's right to cancel. Please read these. It's very, very helpful, very specific, because the buyer may say to you, what rights do I have to cancel? Go to section 14D and it tells you exactly what your rights are. But if they read the contract before, they should know that. But do give them guidance. If the seller says, can I cancel? A lot of times sellers will say, why would I cancel this buyer? I don't like them anymore. Well, you can cancel, can I cancel? Well, you can cancel, but know that more than likely the buyer will put a lis pendens on you. And more than likely, you're going to have to pay commissions because we did our job. So let them read the contract before you get into ugly conversations like that. It tells them what they can and can't do, and it's very specific. And they have to use the proper forms, of course. Let's see. Can we go to the effects of cancellation on deposits?
Where's that at?
That would be on page 11.
Page 11. Okay.
In section, let's see. Right above repairs, 15. Yeah.
Oh, here we go, right here.
Yeah. And this is a legal judgment. If you want to read this section, it says, note, neither agents nor escrow holder are qualified to provide any option on whether either party has acted in good faith or which party is entitled to the deposited funds. Buyer and seller are advised to seek the advice of a qualified California real estate attorney regarding this matter. So that's what goes along with me saying earlier in the class, please don't tell anybody, don't worry about it, you're going to get their deposit, or don't worry about it, the seller will give you your deposit back. We have no idea. So what you can say is the seller may possibly have a claim against your deposit, or we can find out if the seller will release your deposit, but never make statements that you know what's going to happen, because none of us do. Let me go real quickly to probably the end of because I've talked so much about it. On page 13, I just want to point out, well, stop right there, Laura, if you will, and go back up a little bit more, right there, stop. Definitions and instructions. Please read this section very clearly. It talks about, a lot of agents have asked me, well, what is as is? There's the explanation right there. It's a definition of what as is according to this contract. Acceptance, what is acceptance? What is the agreement? Who is the agent? And if you go down a little further onto the next page, Laura. And it talks about, what I like about this is counting the days. What people don't understand is the day something happens, that's day 0. Day 1 starts tomorrow. And it ends at 11:59 p.m. And that's what it explains here. days and delivered. It's so helpful to have these descriptions right here in the contract. Helps us all, and it helps the buyers and the sellers as well. So I'm going to jump over to, obviously, mediation and arbitration is on the next page. They've been left in the contract. Liquidated damages, arbitration. Let's go to expiration of offer. All right. Remember, expiration of offer is in section 3C of the grid. So if you want to know how long the offer is good for, go back to 3C and see what you place there, that the buyer wants to give the seller how much time to respond. Also, entity buyers. This is where you check the block if your buyer is buying as part of a trust, if they are buying it with a corporation, an LLC, a probate. It tells you right there, partnership. You don't have to use the RCSD form any longer. This will suffice. This is giving the information, but you have to complete the information, who the legally authorized signers are. And remember, a trust, a power of attorney, cannot just sign in their name. A trust can't sign. If it's Linda's trust dated today, I can't put an electronic signature, Linda's trust. It has to be my name to sign for it. My name can be the purchaser as my LLC or my trust, but I have to sign. The person that's able to sign, the legal signer, must sign. Okay, and then if there's additional signers, there's an area where you can check the block and then use the ASA form. It's very specific now. It was kind of squirrely last time, but now you can actually fill out this information and move the form up a little bit and onto acceptance area, Laura, so we can see that. There we go. If you're the listing side and you're doing a counter offer or making a backup offer addendum, you mark the block. And it's either a counter offer or a seller's multiple counter. You have to check the block as the representative of the seller. If the seller is a trust, a corporation, an LLC, probate, partnership, power of attorney, that block has to be checked, state what it is, and then down the bottom, you have to say who the legal signer is, and then you're basically filling out the RCSD form as part of the contract. It's just what made the contract a little bit longer in pages as well. And then if it's a trust or whatever, you need to have the full name of the trust there. And once again, the RPA is 16 pages. Seller acknowledges receipt of, has read and understands every page and all its attachments that make up this agreement. So it's not only telling the buyer above their signatures, read the contract before you sign it, it's also telling the seller for you as well. And then fill it out as it's required. If there's a legal signer involved, they would sign. And if it applies, what their title is, manager or owner or whatever it is of the RCSD. Before, down the bottom, before it was called rejected offer, now it's offer not accepted. So it's a softer way to say your offer has been rejected. And know that in this next section here, if you want to, move it up a little bit, Laura. Let me see. I'm looking for the real estate broker section, which is on the next page. There we go. Okay. In this section, we get a lot of questions. I don't even know if my buyer's offer got presented. How do I find out? Well, if you look under presentation of offer, it's number 4, pursuant to the National Association of Realtors Standard of Practice 1 through 7. If the buyer's agent makes a written request, the seller's agent shall confirm in writing that this offer has been presented to the seller. And they can do that on the bottom of this page. So just know that it is addressed. It is an NAR rule. They do have to comply. The broker section is pretty much the same as it was. You don't need a CBC if the commission's not changing. The commission's changing from what's in the MLS. You do need to add a CBC that would be signed between the brokers. Agent signature. and their license numbers have to be complete, who's signing for that. And then if there's more than one agent from the same firm, that form gets attached. More than one brokerage involved, that form gets attached to the ABA or the AAA. And you know what's funny to me, on the cover sheet in zip forms, it's no longer auto plating the email and text number. And so I wrote to the CAR attorneys about this, and they said that it's actually not required. And it's strange because I was actually requiring our agents to add that info. So I still would add it. I would like contact information for the agents involved in the transaction to see that is easily seen here, email and text number, which would be obviously the cell number, but it is not auto plating from zip forms. So no, if you want to put that information in, this is the area you would type it in if you're the agent writing the offer. And I think that's about it. That wraps it up for as much as I can cover of the additions and changes to the new contract.
So Linda, we have a question.
Sure.
Where do you ask for a roof certification and who pays for what's included in work Q2?
Okay, so let's go back up to that area.
What page is that?
That was page 3.
3, okay.
And it would be 3Q3. Okay.
Right here.
3Q3, yeah, what kind of report? So you could put roof certification report, and you decide with the buyer who's going to pay for it. Customarily, if a buyer's asking the seller for a roof certification, you would say seller's paying for it. And if there's not enough room to write what you want, go down to the bottom of that very same page to additional terms. And yeah, the bottom of page 3, Laura. And they can put down their other terms. Seller to provide buyer with a 3-year, 2-year, 1-year roof certification at the cost of the seller. That's what I would recommend. That's the areas where we've placed things like that.
Okay.
There's other fees and costs down in this area, 3Q16 fees or cost. I don't know that I'd put it under fees and cost. I think I'd put it more under, you know, something you're asking for, along with like a termite report.
Great. Well, thank you, Linda. This was a great class.
No, thank you. Any other questions anybody has?
Now,
Great.
remember, you guys can all access this class on our website, on our education page, and on our YouTube page. So somebody is asking who you are, Linda.
I did introduce myself first. I am Linda DiStefano.
You did, but he was late.
Yeah, I'm a former president of the Association of Realtors, Tri-County Association of Realtors, 2 times, 2002 and 2017. I've also been a CAR director representing Tri-County since the year 2000. My primary committees representing you at the state level are Forum on Forms. And so I get to see the opportunity to see forms created and changed and make comment, because I am also a working broker, manager of Century 21 Care and Diamond Bar. We have a large office. And with the attorney, John Giardinelli, I've been on a committee with him to regarding the revised purchase contract. And yeah, it's been interesting 2 years, because it was supposed to be a 1-year committee and then the contract come out. Ended up 2 years, probably for a better reason, because we really did get all the changes in that we wanted and brought the contract into today. So I've worked with John Giardinelli, and John Giardinelli, like Laura just said, and I taught an 8-hour class that is also recorded on Zoom for you, because I'm coming at the contract from the practitioner side. John comes at the contract from the legal side, and it may benefit you to hear it from the legal side as well.
Yes.
So any other questions?
That's it. Other than thank yous.
Oh, great. Great. Glad you all enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, Linda.
And bye-bye. Talk to you soon, Laura.
Okay.